discovered later, planted by Asa Gray, the great American naturalist, the father of American botany. But one couldn't help seeing this beautiful 18th century house.
Well, first you saw the boxwoods.
And behind it were the boxwoods, which were peeking out the side of the porch.
Now, are boxwoods common in the north?
They are common, but they don't reach this size, and they certainly didn't during what was then the Little Ice Age. We don't exactly know how old these boxwoods are, but they have stems or stalks or trunks that are 6 or 7 inches in diameter, which is big. So it means, and we can track them so far only, to about 1800.
Was the house approachable by road or only by the water?
Well, I approached it by the water, and so of course there was no mailbox there, and so I had to go out to the end of the driveway eventually to put the pieces together, which is really what this book is about. And I discovered it belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Fisk, and I wrote to them, and they kindly asked me to come, and that was when I began to discover that there was a good deal more than boxwoods.
Now, they're named Fisks, but the traditional name is the Sylvesters.
Yes, and because the Sylvester family mostly had boys, it descended in the matrilineal line pretty much all the way, and the present owner is now Eben Ostby, who is the chief animation guy at Pixar, and he's given almost all of the land and the manor house into the public trust by various means, by selling the land, and his nephew, Bennett Connesney, who's a musician and a farmer, is now taking the place on and giving it a new life. But my story begins in 1653 with the arrival of the first 3 Africans from Newport.
Who were brought as slaves.
They were brought as slaves.
Now, the Sylvesters who set up the manor, they had already engaged in slavery in the Indies, hadn't they?
Yes, they had. In 1646, Nathaniel Sylvester, who was the brother and the partner of the 4 Barbadian sugar planters who bought the island in 1651, he had made a trip in 1646 to buy slaves on the Gold Coast. And as I came here this morning, you talk about topical, I hopped a cab from 14th Street, and it was a driver who was listening to your show, and he was from Ghana. And I, of course, had gone up to his city, Kumasi, south of the Volta River, when I was doing research on this book in 1997 through 2001. So what goes around comes around, and he is listening to this now.
Now, you had gone there because that was the source of so many of the slaves who wound up in the Americas, or in the North in particular?
At the time, in the 1650s, when the Sylvesters were first bringing in Africans to both the West Indies and to the North, not so much to the South, because the North was doing the provisioning plantation thing, feeding the West Indies much earlier. Most of them
came
from...
This is where the businesses were.
That's where the businesses were. They mostly came from the Gold Coast. So if you went to all the slave forts, and if you went up country to see where the slaves crossed in coffles from across the border, you would see their country.
How did the Sylvesters come to own and control pretty much all of Shelter Island?
Not pretty much, all, completely. They bought it for a very cheap price, 1,600 pounds of Muscovado sugar, which translates, in terms of the day, to about a quarter of a teaspoon per acre of brown sugar.
But that's still a more expensive than Manhattan was at $24 for the whole island. I guess prices had gone up. What was the form of ownership? As I understand it, Native Americans never thought anybody could own the land. So what was the arrangement?
They bought it first from, the Sylvesters first bought it from someone who claimed it, a man called Stephen Goodyear from the New Haven colony. But shortly thereafter, Chekano, one of the Manhansets on the island who spoke English and who was pretty adroit at reading legal documents, said, wait a minute, you have to buy it from us. So they bought it for a second time. But we don't know because the pages from the Southold book are missing, just like quite a lot of this story.
But didn't Alice and Andrew, the people who you met, referred to the workers on the plantation as servants? Were they being coy or reluctant to describe the role of slavery in the history of the place?
That is a really interesting question. I was stunned when I realized that the people they called servants were in fact slaves. But the more I read of 17th and 18th and early 19th century history, the more I realized that people who were enslaved were also called servants, just like indentured servants or like free workers.
Is it fair to describe that couple as very attached to the historical importance of their family and their home?
Yes, I would say that they were very much attached to it, and also that Alice Fisk, as a memorial to her husband, who died in 1992, set up the Andrew Fisk Memorial Center for Archaeology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston.
Although I think it's probably fair to say that if it weren't for their historical pedigree and socioeconomic class, they might be more likely to be featured on the Hoarders than History Channel.
Yes.
They had everything
they
had ever owned and everybody else had owned over 11 generations?
Well, you know, when you don't move, everything stays with you. And so in the house, hidden in the wallpaper, was this extraordinary fireproof vault. And in it were papers dating from 1644 to the present day.
And Andrew took you to that hidden vault?
He did indeed.
How were things organized in the vault? Or
well,
were they?
They were partly organized, and to tell you the truth, I never quite figured out what Andrew's system was. But he had selected which were the most important documents to him, and they included the 1666 Charter, which he kept in a big red leather-covered book with lead plates to flatten out the documents. And I was just amazed to see that it was a charter for the Manor of Shelter Island with all the privileges thereunto accruing, which lasted for quite a long time and gave the Sylvesters quite a jump up, politically and economically.
As a historian, were you at all horrified that these documents and artifacts weren't being preserved in a museum or some other place that might have kept them in better shape?
Well, that's where they are now. And it was thanks to New York University's Carol Mandel, who's the director of libraries there, and eventually also to Barbara Goldsmith, whose wonderful lab at NYU kept the papers for 2 years, that they finally found ultimate safety.
Wasn't there also a letter from Thomas Jefferson?
There's a letter from Thomas Jefferson. There's a whole extraordinary list of accounts, and it was about the Hessian fly, the Thomas Jefferson letter, which was a common pest. There's a whole list of accounts and inventories that tell you about people who in one sentence are known as slaves, and in another sentence are as slaves with their names, and then in another accounting they'll be listed by their monetary value.
My guest is Mac Griswold, a cultural landscape historian, author of Washington's Gardens at Mount Vernon and The Golden Age of American Gardens. She's written for many publications, and her latest book, 29 Years in the Making, is The Manor, 3 Centuries at a Slave Plantation on Long Island, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Why did it take so long? Were you waiting for Andrew and Alice to die?
No, not at all. I could not have written the book without Alice, who helped me a great deal in presenting papers to me and coming up with ideas, and we used to drink Mount Gay in the afternoon, and that's all part of the book. I actually saw the place in 1984, but then went off and wrote 2 other books. And then in 1997, as I was finishing the research on the book about Washington's Gardens,
you suddenly realized...
I suddenly realized that this was my subject.
Well, of course, Washington was a slave owner in Virginia. We associate slavery with Virginia. How common was slavery in the North?
It was very common, and there were dozens, if not scores, of provisioning plantations all around Long Island Sound in the 17th and 18th centuries.
On the scale of Sylvester Manor?
A few of them were, particularly in what was then known as the Narragansett, which is that lovely southerly part of Rhode Island. But the interesting thing is that the idea of slavery was whitewashed out by the Civil War, so that it was forgotten.
Well, I remember being taught that it was a passing phase created by a need to clear the land, but not a sustained social institution. But how long were slaves kept on Sylvester Manor?
Well, 167 years to be exact, which is 5 generations. There are 11 generations of the Sylvester family, and during the first 5 generations that you can count, between 1653, when those 3 people stepped ashore from Newport, until 1820, when they freed the last slave, there was slavery at the manor.
And were the slaves freed because of changing laws in the North?
Yes. You probably know all about this, Leonard. Yes, they were. There was a graduated manumission law passed in 1799, whereby in excruciatingly slow stages, people were freed until 1827, the last year of slavery in New York.
Now, they weren't growing cotton or tobacco on Sylvester Manor. What were they doing there?
The whole system, every region that has slavery has a different system. And in the North, because of climate, the conditions were very different. So the Sylvesters, who had 24 people, the largest number in the North at the time that the inventory was taken in 1680, were using them, yes, to clear the land, but also to grow multiple crops and to make barrel staves to ship south, because the barrel was the shopping bag of the West Indies to barrel sugar and all the other sugar products besides sugar, rum, etc.
So they were supplying their own sugar plantations in Barbados.
And many others as well, because they were a pretty big kinship consortium. And so slavery in the North, while it seems less punitive, less regimented than the big plantations of the South, it had its own cruelties. It had its own specific deprivations, including the loss of privacy and the loss of family life, because in the North, slaves slept in the attic or in the lofts over any outbuilding. And when Andy took me through the house for the first time, I said, "Where does that door go?" And Andy said, "To the slave staircase."
Which was different than the other staircase.
Yes, because that staircase, the slave staircase, was dark, and it had 14-inch risers, very hard to climb up, and the front staircase, you walked on it as if it were air, as effortlessly as any white person can rise through the socioeconomic ranks.
Were all the slaves African, or were there also Indians as slaves?
They were nominally not slaves, but of course they were impressed into the workforce, and then soon thereafter, after the 1680s, if you follow the trail of wills and inventories in other families, you constantly find the Indian slave. So yes, they were enslaved.
The big shocker for me is that the Sylvesters were Quakers, and I've always thought that Quakers were opposed to slavery.
Hey, me too. There were so many surprises in this book.
These were not just Quakers, but they were Quaker activists, and they actually helped other Quakers who were escaping from England.
Right. Or escaping from Boston, escaping from England, going to Barbados to preach, and then escaping to Boston. And the thing that I discovered that makes it all come straight is, or make sense, is that George Fox started the Society of Friends, so to speak, in 1647. But there was no idea that Quakers, or Friends as they called themselves, could not hold slaves until a century later, 1758, when the first meeting, that was the Philadelphia meeting, said, "Any Quaker who holds slaves shall be barred from meeting."
Now, you've discovered there was also a so-called Negro garden on the premises.
Yes.
Was that, did the slaves grow things to feed themselves?
Well, there are 2 places on Sylvester Manor Plantation that were places where Africans and African Americans could express themselves. One was the slave cemetery, where they could bury people with their own rites that would remind them of funerals back home in Africa.
Are there markers on?
There are none. There are none.
This is kind of like This is kind of like the slave cemetery in downtown Manhattan.
That's right. It's like the African burial ground. And as for the African garden, all we knew about it was that it was near a hedge, it was near a spring, and then the archaeologists began to dig, and they located a site which we can tentatively identify as the Negro Garden. Really rare in the north. This place is unique.
And they also found old pottery and some other valuable things. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but I want everyone to know that Mac Griswold will be giving a reading and tours of the Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island this coming Saturday at 2 o'clock. For more details, check out our show page at wnyc.org. Can anybody go to the Sylvester Manor these days?
Anybody can go at certain hours, but on Saturday it will be free admission, and I'll speak between 2 and 3 on what's called visible and invisible. Thank you so much, Leonard. This was a real pleasure.
Mac Griswold's book is The Manor, 3 Centuries at a Slave Plantation on Long Island, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Well, it's been a pleasure for me as well.
WNYC is supported by Uber, everyone's private driver, providing on-demand black car service with a phone app. More information at uber.com/WNYC.
Saturday afternoons on WNYC. Smart, thought-provoking, engaging.
So, okay, why does a kid like Jonathan Perez get himself arrested on purpose by Border Patrol?
Xavier, you work in fashion?
Yep.
So how would you describe your fashion sense?
Brooklynish.
Brooklynish.
Passive-aggressive.
Passive-aggressive. Join us Saturday afternoons on 93.9 FM.
On tomorrow's show, foster mother Chris Beam reveals what she's learned about the intricacies of the foster care system after 5 years of research and being a foster parent herself. Plus, we'll take a look at how working